The informal economy has struck me as being quite important, and I'll talk a bit about that, but quite briefly, because probably many of you realise that the informal economy is quite important in sub-Saharan Africa and other regions throughout the world. But one of the reasons why I'm quite interested in it is that I've been interested in Africa for about 15, 16 years now, and I've been studying African countries. And a few years ago, I did quite a big study of 15 sub-Saharan African countries, which was mainly concentrated within the commercial sector as well as the public sector. So we looked in breadth at about 15 countries, and we were looking at things like management styles and organisational culture and so on, because it hadn't been done before, it hadn't been documented, and it was a bit of a descriptive study, but I think it was quite useful at the time and drew out certain aspects of managing in Africa. And one of the things that we were looking for, we were looking at different management styles and different organisational culture, and identifying what was generally regarded as being African. You know, so if you look at some of the older management literature on Africa, if you indeed can find any, but that bit that you can find, it talks in a derogatory tone about Africa, African institutions, African management, and so on. And it's what we were looking at. You know, where did that come from? And we were looking at you know, sort of post-colonial remnants, if you like, colonial institutions, and how that translated into you know, what you have now in terms of particularly public sector organisations, some of the larger commercial sector organisations. And the other thing we looked at was well, what's the solution? If you're being pejorative about this mode of managing and calling it African, you know, what is the solution? So obviously the solution in Western terms is modern management, and you know, how can you introduce this? And this is what you tend to get if you look at an MBA program, for example, in Nairobi or wherever. You'll find that you've got Western textbooks. You'll find that, you know, people are learning about Western modes of managing and organising, because this is seen as a solution. But you know, if you look at what's happened since Western management was started to be introduced in African countries, I don't think it's really found a solution. And then you've got this kind of embryonic, what we called African Renaissance. You know, this, for those of you that are familiar with these terms in South Africa, this Ubuntu management, this more sort of humanistic management, which wasn't based on a sort of an instrumental view of human beings, but is more based on African communities and so on. And we tried to identify this in the organisations that we looked at and couldn't really find it. I mean, there were sort of isolated organisations like Afriland First Bank in Cameroon, which said that they sort of based their management principles on African communities. And, you know, to a certain extent they did, and then they started to get bigger. You know, they did things like, you know, they all sat round a table and deliberated and got consensus on decisions, and they helped colleagues. You know, one of the banes of Western organisations is people going to funerals in Africa. You know, they don't like it because people go off for long periods of time to funerals. And Afriland First Bank, for example, took this view that, you know, we would help people. We would go along to the funeral with them. We would send a colleague and we would help them through this difficult period and so on. So it was a different view of you know, what African management is all about. But these were very few and far between. I mean, I point to that example simply because it's one of the examples that we found, and we didn't find many others. And for a long time, I've known that the informal economy is important to Africa. I come on in a minute to a few statistics on this, which, you know, many of you are familiar with, I know, but it is important. But as a cross-cultural management specialist, how do I study this? You know, how do I go about, you know, in terms of access, for example, you know, how do I get access? Who do I work through? Who do I work with? How do I study this? Etc., etc. So it was quite difficult, you know, sort of coming at this and deciding after 15 years that I really need to study the informal economy because it's important. So what I want to look at today then, getting on to the presentation itself, why is the informal economy important? And I'll have a look at that in a minute. And the informal economy and policy, because there's a lot of policy directed the informal economy in different African countries. You know, there's different views of what the informal economy is. There's different perceptions of the informal economy. The extent to which the informal economy contributes to employment, employability and skills development, which is absolutely, you know, quite substantial in many sub-Saharan African countries. And then what I started to talk about towards a cross-cultural understanding of organisational activity within the informal economy. Some people even sort of dispute the fact that there is something that you can call the informal economy and talk more about informal activity because it's so sort of intertwined sometimes with formal activity, if you like. And then some of the implications of research, because I've got to admit that this is something that I've only been looking at for probably less than a year, and it's something that we've been putting funding bids in, and it's something that we haven't done any empirical research on yet. You know, so it's actually starting to think, well, how can we look at this? How can we study this? I'm not going to go into detail in this because you know this is information that you can find out for yourself if you like. But it's quite important. It's quite big. You know, 42.3% of gross national income. But the interesting thing about the size of it, and you know, despite some predictions, it hasn't shrunk. It doesn't appear to be shrinking. It appears to be actually growing in size. And again, I'll come on to that in a second. And the extent to which it actually employs people is quite significant. You know, 72% of total employment, if you include South Africa in that. And the extent to which, you know, this isn't up-to-date figures, but in the 1990s, you know, 93% of new jobs created in Africa within the informal economy. So this is, you know, quite significant. I'm not sure, it's mostly employed in retail. I mean, certainly the retail industry is big. I mean, it's a big part of the informal sector. But there are other significant aspects of the informal economy within different countries. East Africa, for example, manufacturing seems to be quite significant. And some countries, I put 94.1% in Mali, but Mali, I think, also the figures there also include agricultural workers, which isn't included in other statistics for other countries. So, you know, there are different national definitions of what is the informal economy, and therefore you get these kind of differences among the countries. But I think the important thing is that, you know, many people wouldn't survive without the informal economy in sub-Saharan Africa. It provides goods and services. It provides employment. It enables people to, you know, defy the published GDP per capita in those countries. Because if you simply relied on that, you would think, well, how do people possibly survive within this economy? It also absorbs labour which isn't absorbed within, you know, non-existent jobs in the formal economy, if you like, and significantly women as well. And also, I mean, this is Fantu Cheru, who some of you may have come across. He's now I think he's the research director for, what's it called? There's an institute in Uppsala in Sweden. Nordic Africa Institute, yeah. He's now, but he's sort of gone through the ranks of World Bank and various other institutions. But he sees that it's the informal economy is actually a way of resisting, you know, sort of the predatory encroaches of the formal state within sub-Saharan African countries. So why, you know, and I'm speaking from the perspective of a specialist in cross-cultural management, why is it important to cross-cultural management, and what's the significance of the informal economy to cross-cultural management, and why taking a cross-cultural management perspective is important, if you like? Now, the first thing is that and this is quite unusual. This is from a Kenyan that I've taken this view from, but it seems to be typical that you've got this view that traditional community, African communities, in some way are against entrepreneurship. There's this view that because of the collectivist nature, I guess, of communities within Africa, they kind of suppress entrepreneurial activity. Now, if you go into any sub-Saharan African country and you look around the markets and so on, I mean, evidence your evidence of your eyes actually defies that. But also, I think it's a misunderstanding of what entrepreneurship actually is. The Western definition of an individual, going out to make as much money as possible, rather than a more sort of social enterprise, if you like, and a community enterprise, and developing, the community, the family, etc., etc. So maybe it's a misunderstanding about what entrepreneurial activity actually is, but there does seem to be this view, and I think it's more in line with this view that the pejorative nature of perceptions of African management and organisations and business and so on, and the problems more than the positive aspects. And again, this is Fantu Cheru. A closer look at the informal sector in Africa provides a glimpse of what could be achieved if Africa's economies and financial policies were more attuned to the continent's everyday realities. And what we got time and time again when we were interviewing people for the study that I mentioned at the beginning, and we looked at 4 countries, and we looked at depth of those 4 countries, and we interviewed a number of managers and staffs and so on. And the view that we quite often got is that when I go into work in the morning, I step outside my culture. When I go back home, I step back inside my culture. And this is what I mentioned at the beginning. We were kind of looking at, well, if you can say that there's an authentic African management, what would this be? Could we find it in big commercial organisations or the public sector? What is it? Are there a sector, or are there organisations that are more in tune with the community, and therefore you don't get this reaction that people are stepping outside their culture when they go into work? So it's more this kind of, sort of this search for this authentic management, if you can talk about that. And the other aspect, I think, is that this is again a quote that I quite like. Economic informality is central to the world economy. So we've had a look at the size and how it contributes to employment and so on, but it remains largely unexamined. Informal business are difficult to study, but this doesn't absolve business researchers for attempting to do so, especially in parts of the world such as Africa, where they are predominant forms of organisation. So, in other words, I mean, this is understudied. It's not. I don't know. I can't point to one study that actually looks at the informal organisation at the organisational level, at the management level, at the business level, at the level of the community. There's lots of studies that in economics, for example, that looks at the informal economy statistically, I guess. So, to what extent does the informal economy, to what extent is it a part of the total economy, and things that I've already pointed to in terms of employment, etc., etc. So there's lots of studies like that, but there's very little, if none, at the organisational level.